Turning back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin now, where Donald Trump's newly minted running mate will headline the Republican National Convention tonight. J.D. Vance will officially accept the vice presidential nomination in a primetime speech and sell himself to Republican delegates and American voters. The CBC's Katie Simpson is at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. So, Katie, while we stand by to hear from Donald Trump's running mate, you just interviewed one of Donald Trump's family. What happened?
Yeah, Eric Trump was not far from where we're set up here broadcasting inside the convention center. And so, as we do as journalists, you just kind of sneak on up and you ask his people if he could stop for one quick question with Canada's public broadcaster. And guess what? We were able to sort of sneak our way in there and get in there. And so I don't know if my question is included in the tip, because literally this just happened.
Right.
So if the question is included in the clip or not. But I asked him, you know, has your father's vision for America changed since the attempted assassination? And if so, how? Here's what Eric Trump, Donald Trump's second son, had to say.
When your life flashes before your eyes, you almost have your head blown off by a madman. I think that changes you a little bit. And you know, we saw that. I was watching that with my kids on a couch with my two young children as they almost watched their grandfather, my father, you know, get killed that day. And we didn't really know what was going on for that first hour until he finally called me from the hospital. You know, and then 48 hours later, I'm casting the deciding vote that puts him over the threshold to become Republican nominee for president of the United States, right? So you've got these highs and lows in life. And, you know, he walked out that night and it was beautiful. Everybody in this auditorium was in tears and it was a very somber moment.
Certainly the delegates who were on the floor and saw Donald Trump emerge with his ear bandaged also described it as a very emotional moment. I went on to ask him, you know, how have you noticed your father change since what happened on Saturday? And he says from his perspective that his father seems to have more of a sense of humility. Donald Trump will speak on Thursday evening to close out the Republican National Convention. And the question is, what kind of tone is he going to take? If you look at some of his social media posts, some of those suggest that the same kind of rhetoric he has used throughout his entire political career remains there. But we've also heard that he plans to take on a tone of unity, calling on Americans to come together in the wake of this the shooting that took place on Saturday in Butler, Pennsylvania. We know that Donald Trump's base of support, they are very enthusiastic and very engaged. And what we've seen in the past is the tone that Donald Trump takes, or the points that he makes at his political rallies, often his supporters really embrace them, adopt them, and will repeat them back. There's not a lot of daylight in between them. So whatever tone Donald Trump sets on Thursday, expect that to sort of really be the tone that we're going to hear from his base of support as well.
Okay, and we may get a preview of that tonight, right, Katie? Because J.D. Vance, who is the counterpoint to Kamala Harris, he's going to give his big speech tonight. What can we expect?
Yeah, this is the biggest platform that J.D. Vance has ever had in his political career. Really, it could be a defining moment. Donald Trump selected him, even though when J.D. Vance really emerged onto the public stage in the United States, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, his memoir, the story about growing up in poor rural America and really dealing with class divides, poverty, and dealing with addiction, those kinds of challenges that are so entrenched in the American story for so many, millions and millions and millions of Americans, and his ability to sort of navigate and make his way to this point. He started his career on the public stage as really an anti-Trumper, saying some really intensely critical things about Donald Trump. But we are told, according to reporting done in the New York Times and other U.S. news outlets, that J.D. Vance went to Mar-a-Lago to talk to Donald Trump to say he was wrong and really try to make amends. And then when he ran for Senate in 2022, he sought out that endorsement from Donald Trump and really embraced his political positions, whether it comes to what's going on in the wake of January 6th and what happened with the 2020 election. J.D. Vance saying that he would not have done what Mike Pence did. Remember how Mike Pence was under pressure from Donald Trump to interfere to stop the peaceful transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden? Well, J.D. Vance says if he were VP at that time, he would have done things differently. He would have listened to Trump. So this is an individual who very publicly is one of the largest supporters of Trump and essentially is in this position where when Trump is going to ask him to do things, he's going to have the ability now, if there is another Trump presidency, he is going to be in that position to make those decisions at the time, and whether he follows through whatever the decisions are to be made, whatever the sort of challenges ahead ahead are going to be if there is a Trump administration. So J.D. Vance, we know he is a populist. He's also an isolationist. A lot of foreign leaders are going to be watching what J.D. Vance has to say. He has very strongly advocated against additional American funds for Ukraine and really wants to impose new tariffs on trading partners as well as adversaries. So his populist, isolationist sort of positions that he's taken publicly, you know, everyone will be watching to see what he says tonight and what tone he's going to take. One other thing you should watch for tonight, David, or what our viewers should be watching for tonight, is the message he delivers about affordability, talking about Ohio, where he is from, where he represents in the Senate right now. He is expected to talk about how life became unaffordable under Joe Biden through the cost of living crisis. It's not just happening in Canada. I know there's a cost of living crisis in Canada, but there's also a cost of living crisis here in the United States. And so he is expected to really lean into that, to talk about ways that another Trump administration would try to make life more affordable for working class and poorer American families.
Okay, Katie, thank you so much. And great work on getting Eric Trump. That's the CBC's Katie Simpson in Milwaukee. Christopher Devine is an associate professor of political science at the University of Dayton in Ohio. He's also written 2 books on the impact running mates have on an election ticket, and he joins me now. Professor, it's good to see you. Thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you predicted that Donald Trump would select J.D. Vance as his running mate well before it was announced. You must have had an inkling. Why do you think he did it?
I've gotten plenty of things wrong about predicting politics in the last number of years, but yeah, that is one that I thought made a lot of sense. I don't think it makes sense in appealing to voters. I can explain why. But in terms of Donald Trump's decision-making, it did line up pretty well. And I say that because when we look back at the 2016 selection of Mike Pence, Donald Trump, reflecting back on that this time around, I think saw that as a bad choice, not because Pence hurt him in the campaign or did not serve him loyally in office, but really just that one thing on January 6th where Donald Trump asked Mike Pence to do something that the Constitution didn't provide for. Pence said no to it on that basis, and Trump has regretted that apparently, or at least villainized Pence for it. I think this time around he was looking for the type of person who, as he has indicated, J.D. Vance would have said yes to him on January 6th rather than no, as Mike Pence did.
Yeah, Pence more of an establishment Republican, Vance more of what, a mega movement Republican? Would you characterize their differences in terms like that?
Yeah, it's a little hard to define. Populism, of course, is a term we hear a lot that's hard to pin down, but J.D. Vance certainly is more of a populist conservative. He might frame that as America First conservative, have it as you will, but he's someone who I think really doubles down on Donald Trump's agenda, the policies he stood for. He's not a moderating choice who's going to really challenge Donald Trump on a lot of policy views. If anything, he might encourage him to, kind of escalate, whether that's in terms of policy or, some of the other decisions he might have to make as president, or things he's inserted himself into, like January 6th electoral vote count, for example.
Yeah, that's right, because conventional or historic thinking was that you pick someone to balance out the ticket, to bring geographic or representation into play to help you. But you published an op-ed here saying that J.D. Vance is actually going to hurt Trump's campaign, and you wrote that he is the least qualified vice presidential candidate in modern history. Why do you think those things?
Yeah, I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it happily, and nor is it anything specific about this being the Republican VP pick. Look, Donald Trump was looking at 2 people in Marco Rubio, the Florida senator, and Doug Burgum, the North Dakota governor, who I would say clearly were qualified for that office. They would have been excellent choices, not just in terms of their ability to perform the role once in office, but also in convincing voters that Donald Trump was serious about a second term, about governing in a second term. The J.D. Vance pick is not one that sends that kind of a signal. Donald Trump has picked someone who only was sworn into the Senate, his first political office, last 18 months ago in January 2023. That's not something that really tells voters that Trump is serious about governing. They have to ask what other factors went into Vance's selection, and I think a lot of them have more to do with politics than they do to governance.
Well, what political considerations, right? Because, you think about balancing the ticket, but this in some way sort of amplifies what's already there in Trump, right? Given there's sort of alignment on a lot of things. So what would be the political reasons that he'd go with J.D. Vance over, say, someone with more experience in the Senate or as a governor who has that executive level responsibility on their resume?
Well, the first one, again, is the issue of loyalty. But as I want to be clear in saying, Mike Pence was loyal. That wasn't enough. He had some kind of outer limit on that where at some point he was willing to tell Donald Trump no. And I think that's something that Trump just cannot tolerate. And so he wants someone who's going to be beyond that, more subservient or exhibiting fealty in that case, more so than even loyalty. So I think that's one consideration, especially if we look forward to the counting electoral votes that Vance would preside over in January 2029. It's not Donald Trump running for a third term at that point. The Constitution doesn't permit that. But some other Republican, perhaps Vance himself, Trump might ask for something similar to that or to back him up on other things that might push the boundaries of constitutional law, for example. But beyond that, I would also say in terms of politics, Trump always wants to reassure his base. You might think, well, the base loves Donald Trump. What's there to convince them? Why would we bother trying to convince them? And I would say that Trump, I think, really just enjoys being the champion of the base of his party. He doesn't want to do anything that would raise doubts or seem like he's compromising on what it is that they want from him. And if he had chosen, let's say, a mainstream candidate like Marco Rubio, firm Trump supporter, but also more mainstream figure, who, by the way, voted to certify the 2020 election, for example, I think the base of the party might have had more of a problem with that, at least the kind of hardcore MAGA base. I think there are others in the Republican Party who would have liked that reassurance. Trump has not given it to them with this pick of Vance.
How do you think the base will react to some of the things that are being dug up in the Oppo research of J.D. Vance of saying, I can't tell if Trump is, a cynical a-hole, I believe is the word, like Nixon, or if he's America's Hitler. I know he's come around big time on Donald Trump, but his history is punctuated with this criticism of the Republican nominee.
Yeah, J.D. Vance, his response to that, I think, has been very clear that, and this goes back to the 2022 Senate campaign, he says, yes, he made those comments, but he's been convinced by Donald Trump. He didn't think that Donald Trump would be a good president. As he's put it, he was a great president, maybe one of the best presidents in his view. And so Vance owns those comments and says, my opinion has changed. Basically, give me credit for being honest. He says we owe it to the American people to be honest with him about these things. Change my mind. And so he's portraying that as something that actually speaks to the strength of Donald Trump. If he can convince someone like me, he's basically saying, who, called him America's Hitler and all this kind of stuff in 2016, all those other people who have been never Trumpers as he once was, or still harshly critical of Trump, he's saying they might change their mind too. They should change their mind and admit that they've been wrong as well.
Right. Look, there's so much focus on Joe Biden's age, but Donald Trump isn't exactly a young man either. There's only 3 years between them, regardless of their vigor levels. So we've got J.D. Vance and Kamala Harris. How do they contrast or resonate with the American public? How does that play in an election campaign where the age of the top of the ticket is such a big deal?
Yeah, with the two of them, age is not a concern. By the way, with Donald Trump, even though objectively his age is up there, that's not far behind Joe Biden. There's some dispute about how sharp it is Trump. But, in comparison to Biden, I don't think that we're clearly seeing voters not nearly as concerned about Donald Trump's age. They're concerned about other things about it, but not his age to the extent they are concerned about Joe Biden's age. That's not even close. Now, as far as their running mates, sure, that provides some reassurance about who could take over. Some people might find comfort in seeing Kamala Harris there as VP and say she's been in there a few years. She had a lot more experience before she got into the office too, so she'd be ready to take over. Other people are not very happy with Kamala Harris. She polls a little bit under Joe Biden. So she's not inspiring a ton of confidence from the American people either, whether that's, deserved or not. She could provide some reassurance or not, depending on who we're talking about. J.D. Vance, similar kind of thing, that here we have a much younger, he's 39 years old, he turns 40 next month, much younger vice president, potentially. He would be the clear successor, constitutionally speaking, during Trump's next term. And so, again, people who like him would find that reassuring, but there are a lot of folks, if not based on politics or policy, then based on experience, might find that not very comforting that Vance is next in line.
So Professor, just quickly, J.D. Vance is going to speak tonight as the first time as the official running mate. He's going to give the big speech on the big stage at the convention. What are you looking for in J.D. Vance's big speech tonight?
Yeah, I think it's an important speech for J.D. Vance. We have to remember that as familiar as he is to those of us who follow politics closely every day, just enjoy this kind of thing, for average Americans, they're not terribly familiar with him. And it's not just him. If you look back at the numbers from 2016, for example, only 39% of the American public could express an opinion one way or another about Tim Kaine or Mike Pence right after they were chosen as the running mates that year. That's typical. And that's about where J.D. Vance is, according to one poll of swing states by Bloomberg a couple months ago. 2/3 of voters either had no opinion of J.D. Vance or had never heard of him, even though he's a best-selling author of Hillbilly Elegy, has made it to a movie, all this kind of stuff. So people have a lot left to learn about J.D. Vance. And so this speech is an opportunity for him and the Republican Party generally to tell a favorable story, a persuasive story about him. They're going to point to his experience growing up in relative poverty and his ability to work his way up to where he is now. They might point to his military service, all kinds of things that would tell people a reassuring story about who he is and why he wants to be vice president. At the same time, by the way, that Democrats are going to be telling a very different story about J.D. Vance. Already we see them portraying him, introducing him to the American public as an extremist when it comes to issues about abortion in particular. They've said so far. They might also talk about his experience down the line. So we're going to be learning a lot more about J.D. Vance, and both sides are going to be trying to shape that story.
Christopher Devine, an associate professor of political science at the University of Dayton in Ohio. It was great to meet you. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thank you, David. It was a pleasure.